welcome. You are watching Oces Balaam. I am the Faceless Narrator, and today we're talking about the Battle of Marathon. With that out the way, let's stab into it.
I'm glad to inform you that this video is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription on-demand video learning service with top-notch lectures and courses from top professors from the Ivy League and other great universities globally, and experts from places like National Geographic. Through your subscription, you get access to a huge library of over 11,000 video lectures about anything that interests you: science, math, history. I have used the Great Courses Plus long before this sponsorship, and I cannot recommend it enough to my viewers. If you're interested in Greco-Roman history, I truly think that you should check The Rise of Rome, a series of lectures by Professor Gregory Aldretti that cover the rise and fall of the Roman Republic in detail. The Great Courses Plus is giving viewers a great offer of a free trial. Show your support for my channel by subscribing to the Great Courses Plus. Please visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bellum. Click on the link in the description below to start your free trial today.
The Battle of Lade spelled the end of the revolt for the Greek Ionians against the mighty Persian Empire. This gigantic struggle would last for 5 years, but despite their numerous successes, the rebels would eventually succumb to the Persian juggernaut. With their fleet destroyed and their fighting spirit diminished, the Ionians were now easy pickings for the Persian armada, who would now direct all of its effort against the epicenter of the revolt. After a brief siege, the city of Miletus fell to the Persians, who were not in a particularly merciful mood. The once great metropolis of the Ionians was burned to the ground, and most of its male inhabitants were killed. The boys were castrated, while the women and children were sold into slavery. Following the destruction of Miletus, the Persian fleet began a series of mop-up operations, stumping out any remaining pockets of resistance and annihilating the vestiges of rebellion. The Persians had a special way of reassuring that no rebel would remain uncaptured on the islands, which they called netting. The men would link hands and form a line, reaching from the northern to the southern part of the island, and then advanced over the whole island, hunting people down. After the pacification of Ionia, the Persian fleet sailed towards the Hellespont and proceeded to occupy most of the towns on the eastern side of the Thracian Chersonese. Up until that point, the ruler of the Chersonese was a man who would come to play a key role in the events that were about to occur between the Greeks and the Persians. His name was Miltiades, and he was an aristocrat whose family originated from Athens, but eventually came to rule the Thracian Chersonese. After his brother's death, Miltiades succeeded him and became the ruler of the region. In around 513 BC, the Persian king led a large army into the area and forced the Chersonese into submission, thus making Miltiades a vassal of Persian rule. Miltiades even joined the Persian expedition against the Scythians, and was one of the Greeks left to guard a bridge crossing the Danube, which the Persians had used previously to cross into Scythia. Miltiades joined the Ionian revolt, and around 496 BC returned to the Chersonese, establishing friendly relations with the Athenians by capturing a few islands and ceding them to the city. Now, with the Persian fleet closing in, and with retaliatory intentions in mind, Miltiades loaded 5 triremes with all of his possessions, boarded his family, and sailed off to Athens. In the following year, the great King Darius ordered the mobilization of a huge expeditionary force of 600 ships, accompanied by a large land army. This force would be commanded by the Persian generals Otanes and Mardonius. The empire was about to strike back against the impudent Greeks and punish Eretria and Athens for mingling in Persian affairs. The fleet sailed along the coast of Cilicia and arrived at Ionia. There, Mardonius performed a rather unexpected event and proceeded to depose of all Ionian despots and set up democracies in their cities. With that done, the amphibious force sailed westward along the coast of Thrace and entered Macedonia, which it incorporated into the Persian fold. But when the fleet reached the coasts around Mount Athos, a huge storm broke out and great disaster befell upon the Persian armada. Half of the Persian fleet, around 300 ships, were destroyed or lost, and more than 20,000 men perished during this catastrophe. Others were dashed against the rocks, and some were carried off by wild beasts that, according to Herodotus, abounded in these waters. The land forces, commanded by Mardonius, operated in the immediate area for a while longer and subjugated a few more Thracian tribes before returning back to Asia with the remnants of their fleet. This disaster would postpone the inevitable clash between the mainland Greeks and the Persians for another couple of years. Back in Athens, the fugitive Miltiades did not receive the warmest of welcomes from his compatriots. In fact, he initially received a hostile reception by the democratic Athens and was put on trial for his supposed tyrannical rule of the Thracian Chersonese. Despite the Athenian mistrust towards men who were accustomed to unfettered authority, Miltiades was acquitted and successfully presented himself as a defender of Greek liberty. Miltiades would also make sure the Athenian public were aware of the fact that he was a first-hand witness to Persian tactics, and by adopting this brilliant rhetoric, Miltiades went from the fringes of imprisonment or banishment to being a prominent figure in the political life of Athens. And with the Persians being hell-bent on destroying the city, he would become a strong candidate for assuming general command of the Athenian army. By 490 BC, the Persian war machine had rebounded from the debacle of their first attempted invasion into mainland Greece. This time, however, King Darius had dismissed Mardonius and Otanes and replaced them with his renowned general, Datis, the man who put an end to the Ionian revolt. Datis was accompanied by the son of a Persian satrap from Asia Minor who went by the name of Artaphernes II. The land forces led by Datis marched to Cilicia. There they embarked on 600 ships, and in a fleet similar in size to that of the first invasion, they sailed towards Ionia. However, this time, the Persians had learned their lesson and avoided the circuitous route around coastal Greece. Their first destination was Samos. From there, they sailed across the Icarian Sea and from island to island, straight to their first objective, the Island of Naxxos. Almost a decade earlier, the Naxians were able to withstand a naval siege of about 200 Persian ships during the beginning of the Ionian revolt. This time, however, they didn't even put up a fight and fled to the mountains. The Persian army destroyed their city and enslaved whoever they could capture, thus avenging their previous failure. Like a force of nature, the Armada proceeded to level any resistance it faced on its path, eventually reaching Charistos. The Charistians initially resisted the invaders, refusing to join them against their neighbouring cities, but after the Persians devastated their lands, they eventually came to change their mind. The Persians were now in sight of Eretria, one of their two main objectives. The Eretrians were deeply divided. Most were in favour of resisting the Persians, but yet a small and prominent portion of their aristocracy wanted to submit to their enemies in the hopes that they would gain an advantage for themselves. The Persian army did not deliberate for long and soon commenced a stout attack against the Eretrian city walls. For 6 days, many men fell on both sides, but on the 7th day, 2 reputable Eretrians betrayed their compatriots and opened the city gates. The Persians entered the city and wreaked havoc, burning both temples and buildings to the ground in revenge for the destruction of Sardis. Moreover, the entire population of the city was enslaved, as according to Darius' command. The Persians, now with their ships loaded full of plunder and enslaved citizens of Eretria, had only one remaining objective: the subjugation of Athens. The massive force needed a large and flat plain to disembark that would be both suitable for their horses on land and their numerous ships to anchor at sea. The Persians disembarked the enslaved Eretrians on the island of Agilia, and then guided by the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias, the armada reached the Bay of Marathon. News of the Persian landing soon reached Athens, and even now that the enemy were miles away from the city gates, the Athenians were not determined on how to deal with this threat. The 10 generals of the Athenian army debated whether to wait behind their city walls or to directly meet the enemy in the field of battle. Miltiades, the former ruler of the Chersonese, who was initially put on trial by his fellow Athenians, was now one of those 10 generals, and it was he alone who persisted that the Athenians should engage Persia on the field of battle as soon as possible. Being a charismatic orator and the only man who had first-hand experience of the Persian way of fighting, his word eventually carried the most weight among his peers. Military preparations began in earnest. But before the Athenians marched out to meet the invaders, they dispatched a messenger to Sparta, urgently asking for assistance. The day runner delivered his message, but the Spartans were in the middle of a religious festival, and according to their customs, they couldn't march before the next full moon. Unfortunately for the Athenians, this meant that Sparta would be crucially delayed for the next 4 days. Thus the stage was set. The Athenians would face the Persian onslaught on their own. Around the 4th of September, 490 BC, 10,000 Athenian hoplites, led by their generals, marched out and headed towards the plain of Marathon. At dawn on the 5th of September, the Athenians who encamped near the sanctuary of Heracles at Marathon were soon joined by the whole army of the city of Plataea. The army of Plataea totaled around 1,000 men, who managed to come to the aid of the Athenians just in time for the battle. Here the debate between the strategoi was renewed, with half of them in favour of avoiding a direct confrontation with the Persians, and the other half, led by Miltiades, were for facing the enemy in a pitched battle. Eventually, Miltiades once again seized the initiative and used those same rhetorical skills that served him so well previously in order to address the Athenian polemarch, Callimachus. The polemarch was a position that was voted among the generals, and at the time the polemarch was Callimachus of Aphidnae, and as according to Athenian custom, he had the deciding vote on the course of action for the Athenian army. After Miltiades gave a stirring speech urging Callimachus to decide upon a proactive course of action, the polemarch was convinced the Athenians would fight. The huge Persian army was already disembarked and encamped around the eastern side of the plain of Marathon. Their exact numbers are not known. Ancient sources describe the Persian force as ranging from 200,000 to 600,000, but it is not likely to have been much larger than 40 to 50,000 men, which included a cavalry force of 1,000 horses that acted as the trump card for the Persian commander. 2,500 years ago, and the plain of Marathon was a lot more confined than it is today. At its eastern side, near the Persian positions, there was a large marshy area with a small lake that served as a perfect watering source for both men and horse. With that said, equally, on the other hand, grazing areas for cattle and those same horses would have been limited for such a large force, and this fact would play a key role in the upcoming battle. On the western side of the plain, the Athenians were well protected by hilly ground behind them, and from the numerous other choke points that the natural topography had created around them. Thus, a stalemate ensued, with the Persians being reluctant to attack an enemy that was well protected near a confined and rough area with its logistics secured, and the Greeks hesitating, biding their time, in the hopes of finding the perfect moment to entrain a decisive blow to the numerically superior force. After 5 days of this standoff, and according to one ancient lexicon, this perfect moment was revealed to the Athenians by some Ionians that were with the Persian army. "The horses are away," they exclaimed. Apparently, the Persian cavalry had ran out of grass to graze during those 5 days, and Datis was forced to embark his mounts onto transport ships and sail them elsewhere for food. As his communication lines were wholly dependent on his fleet, marching inland while the Athenian army was on his tail would have proved risky. Miltiades lost no time. He immediately arranged his army into battle formation. At dawn, on the 11th of September, 490 BC, a continuous line of 11,000 hoplites marched at a rapid pace towards the Persian positions. The plan was to engage the enemy as fast as possible whilst they were ill-prepared, and to minimize their exposure to Persian archery. It was probably the first time in recorded history that formations were deliberately tweaked and used as part of an overall tactical plan. Miltiades had weakened his centre in order to extend his lines as much as possible and avoid envelopment, also making sure to strengthen both of his wings by increasing the numbers of ranks in their depth. The Athenian hoplites, dressed in full gear, began covering a distance of about 1.5 kilometers that separated the two lines. At some point, the Persians must have realized they were being charged by the Athenian infantry and hastily began taking their positions. The exact Persian deployment is unknown, except for the center that was occupied by their best troops, which were the Saki and the Persians themselves. All the while, the Athenians were closing in, and at around 500 meters before the Persian lines, and shortly before they entered within range of the Persian archers, the whole Athenian army began sprinting. The Greek hoplites were well prepared for this kind of physical exertion. There was even a contest at the Olympic Games called the Oblitodromia, in which runners who were equipped with greaves, a helmet and a shield had to cover a distance of around 360 meters. Thus, most of the Greek soldiers were perfectly capable of running this distance while still being able to fight once they got there. Soon the hoplite phalanx was in range of the enemy archers, and a hail of arrows was unleashed upon them from the skirmishers who were aboard the ships anchored near the shore. Joining the skirmishers was the archers who were positioned behind the Persian main line. Within a few moments, the Athenians had smashed into the Persian ranks with an impressive momentum. It was the first time that a Greek army had charged an enemy in such a fashion, and according to Herodotus, it was the first time that the Greeks had endured the sight of Persian garments, since up until this point, they were terrified by their very name. Shields clashed against shields, and spears splintered, as the heavily armoured Greeks engaged with the Persians who were unaccustomed to such kind of close-quarters fighting. A ferocious struggle ensued, with both sides trying to pace themselves and get over the initial shock which they had both endured. But the Athenians pressed on, and their reinforced wings began to dislodge their Persian counterparts. The fighting was so fierce that most of the men in the front lines were now slashing the enemy with their swords, since their spears were broken. We can only imagine how stressful and physically demanding for the fighting men in the front ranks this pushing stage must have been. With more than 15 ranks of men pushing forward with their shields behind them, the soldiers at the front ranks would have endured immense pressure while trying to fend off enemy blows, and at the same time trying to deliver a few of their own. In the centre though, the Saki and the Persian heavy troops began to get the better of the thinly stretched Athenian hoplites and started pushing them back. The massively outnumbered Greeks began to buckle under the onslaught, and a few ranks actually broke and fled from the field of battle. Meanwhile, the heavily armoured and reinforced Greek wings were finding more success. The Athenians and the Plataeans were equally successful in driving back the Persians, and it wasn't long before they had driven them all the way to the fringes of the Great Marsh. Being unable to pose a proper defence against the hoplite phalanx, and without steady footing upon the marshy ground, the Persians panicked and began to break, attempting to flee for their ships through the marshes. Miltiades' plan was working like a charm, but instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, the disciplined hoplites turned around and charged the victorious Persian centre from behind. The enveloped Persians and Saki fought bravely, but being surrounded from all sides, they ultimately stood no chance. Many fought to the death, as others tried their best to break out the encirclement and flee to their ships. At this stage of the battle, it must have dawned on the Greeks that they were victorious, but the bloodied, frenzied hoplites would not let their enemy escape. Flushed by their triumph, the Athenians went after the Persians who were trying to embark their ships that were still arrayed on the shoreline. It was probably around this point of the engagement when Callimachus, the Athenian pole march, who was positioned on the honorary right wing of the formation, was killed. Reportedly, the body of Callimachus was pierced with so many spears that although dead, he stood upright. What followed next was nothing short of wholesale butchery. Formations were abandoned, and the whole battle around the ships devolved into individual combat. It must have been a truly Homeric scene. During this battle by the ships, many renowned Athenians lost their lives, including Kinagiros, the brother of the famed dramatist, Aeschylus, who gripped one of the Persian ships with his hand and had it chopped off by a Persian axe. The Athenians succeeded in capturing 7 ships, but the majority of the Persian fleet managed to weigh anchor. When the dust settled, almost 6,000 Persians were lying dead on the battlefield, while the Greeks had only lost 192 of their own men. Miltiades had been correct all along, and his gamble eventually paid off. The Persians could be defeated. The Battle of Marathon was a pivotal moment in Western history. It ensured the survival of Western civilization and the eventual flourishing of the classical ancient Greek culture. In the grand scheme of things, this defeat was only a minor setback for the mighty Persian Empire, but it was a major psychological victory for the Greeks, who had proven to themselves that the Medes were not unbeatable. That said, this unexpected hitch had now ensured that the entire Persian war machine would be mobilized against those puny Greeks. Thank you for watching our video on the Battle of Marathon. If you have made it this far, please consider subscribing, sharing, commenting, and all the other good stuff that tricks the YouTube gods into showing our video with as many people as possible. A big thank you to Oches Balaam for giving me the opportunity to come dazzle you all with my raspy Scottish accent. If you would like to hear more of my slightly sinister vocal tones, you can do so by visiting the Faceless Narrator here on YouTube, where we focus on the unusual and often macabre characters from ancient history.